Start drilling down into the server object model, and we start looking at server-side access. So this is when you are on the SharePoint farm, you're building an application or trying to get a task completed on the server side. This would include web parts that you would add to your SharePoint site collections, and any sort of server controls that you add. A lot of server-side access revolves around accessing lists and list data. If you do this directly through the server object model, you find its performance is extremely bad. A lot of the server object model, by the way, is obviously managed code and it's common, therefore you have specific patterns for opening and closing objects within it. It's very flexible, the server-side object model, but as I've said, it's very slow for working with list data, especially when the lists start getting big and you start doing complex queries on the lists and doing relational lookups on the list data. So generally, to manipulate data within SharePoint 2010, you have several options. You obviously have the SP list and options of querying lists. It's very slow. What you normally would go for is using the SP query object within the current site collection, and you can also use the SP site query data query, which crosses site collections. And then what you do is you actually build camel queries to go and get your data. We'll go into this in a little bit more detail on the next slide, but as you'll see, camel is notoriously difficult. It was used in SharePoint 2007 and was actually the de facto standard for getting list data out. Now we are looking specifically at link to SharePoint. So we are still within the server object model, but we're going to be looking at using link to SharePoint. Link to SharePoint is also known as Splink or SPMetal. Those are sort of common terms you'll hear banded around, but its official name is Link to SharePoint. Link to SharePoint was around in MOS 2007. It was a Codeplex project, and it wasn't officially supported. It was a third-party plugin. It would only really do select queries. It was very limited in its use. Looking at how Link to SharePoint works is there's a whole hierarchy that it follows. Firstly, you have list data within SharePoint. So if you look at the diagram, the very bottom option is your actual list data. This list data is queried using the camel code, and in turn on top of that, SPMetal actually sits on top of that, and SPMetal's code is actually converted, or queries is converted into camel. So you can actually intercept your link to SharePoint queries and examine the camel, and actually, if you wanted to, you could actually rewrite the camel instead of writing a link to SharePoint query, and you'd have the camel generated for you, which can actually be very useful, especially when you're trying to figure out what's going on behind the scenes. Link syntax is pretty standard. You can use things called lambda expressions, which is a shorthand notation to go and get data out. It's very useful. I'd be careful using lambda expressions because you find a lot of development teams, the developers don't all understand lambda expressions. I understand very basic lambda expressions, but I'd say generally stay away from lambda expressions. There's no real reason to use them. The main advantage to using link to SharePoint is your access to your lists and your queries are strongly typed. So you can now go and use IntelliSense within your Visual Studio IDE, and it'll tell you what the properties are called and how to get out the data. It will also run at compile time, so if your code doesn't compile, you know it doesn't work. Now, traditionally in SharePoint 2007, you used to write camel queries, which is just an XML query, which could be extremely complex. You didn't know if they were right or wrong. You just used to plug in this XML string, and if you didn't get a result, you didn't really know where to start. So what you had to do then was sort of go and step by step try and look at what was actually wrong with your camel query. And generally you used a tool called U2U. Which build camel queries. It's mainly for actually just querying data. It doesn't do joins, it doesn't do a lot of things inserting data. So U2U is actually very limited in helping you, but obviously you mainly query using U2U, so it's still a tool that's very valid and works on SharePoint 2010, and you should use it. So that's really the whole process. You actually go and you run the SPMetal tool, which actually sits in your root directory. And within SharePoint, you can run it from the command line natively, and I'll show you the syntax to do that later on. It builds up this proxy, and the proxy is really just a whole lot of entity classes which is built up, and it sticks it in a single file by default. and you can put it in C# or VB, it doesn't really matter. And in turn, that is just a wrapper that sits on top of Camel, and it's got all the data as it's recorded. Now, just a quick caveat on that: when you generate a proxy, it's obviously done at compile time. So if you have things like choice lists, it only is going to go see the data that you have in your choice list at the time when you generate the proxy. So if you went and added a fourth option onto a color scheme choice field, you wouldn't have it within your code. So you need to think about things like that, and therefore lookup lists are often a lot better. One of the key issues around that as well is you generally would use a lookup list to do most of your lookup data. However, it gets pretty heavy, so you need to start looking at things like projected fields within SharePoint to try and reduce these queries and how many queries can be connected. SPMetal in Camel actually allows you to join, I think, up to eight lists. I would say if you're going over 2 or 3, you're probably asking for trouble. It's going to get too heavy on your server. So it's not made for high volume stuff, high transaction, complex queries. But it will cover most tasks. If you think about it, you don't normally traverse that many relationships. In this slide, we are really deciding what data access technique to use to go and retrieve data from the SharePoint 2010 farm. Looking at the chart from the left hand side, I'm just going to go across the top bar. I just want to make sure that you're all on board with how I'm looking at this chart. On the left hand side, I've got the client object model. Then we look at the server object model and what it can do. We look at the REST services, and the last column is the link to SharePoint API. So we just really look at what you can do in each of these techniques for a specific circumstance. So on the first one, we're really looking at on the SharePoint server. So we're looking at when you're actually on the farm, be it in a sandbox solution, you're actually going to deploy code to the farm. And as you can see, the server-side object model is when you can be used here, and the link to SharePoint data access technique can be used while you're actually on the server. On a remote server, you can use the client object models, so any of the 3 options we've discussed. So this is when you on a remote client application that you're building, and you now want to access the list data out of SharePoint or data out of SharePoint. And you can see the REST APIs are very useful, and you can actually mix a link to SharePoint and REST, and therefore actually get link to SharePoint on a remote machine if you wanted to. This is slightly different to what I would have called the slide, but as it's taken from from Todd Bleeker, it's I'd say site objects. You've got to really look at, and the API for the client object model and the server object model is very comprehensive. And you can do a lot more with it, and therefore you'd choose the client object model and the server object model for this. However, when you're working with list data, so it's saying traverse relationships in the next slide, you're really then looking at the server object model, the REST APIs, and link to SharePoint. So when you want to work with list data, which is what you predominantly do in building database applications, you would want to use REST or link to SharePoint, depending on where you are. We have to have a quick look at the calling pattern. The calling pattern is how you have to batch up code, or if it's executed straight away. So in this example, the calling pattern direct on the server object model means that as you write something to the API, it actually will go and perform that action on your behalf. And link to SharePoint, obviously being on the server, works in exactly the same way as the server object model. The sort of a callback calling pattern is when you actually have to batch up multiple of your arguments and then say go and execute the command now, and that's what you do in the client object model and using the REST API. So you do your 5 actions and you batch it into one request and you send it out. And you could actually send it out after each request, but you'd still have to specifically send each request. It just doesn't do it automatically. The last column on here is strongly typed, obviously very useful because your code will compile and you'll know that you're pretty close to what you're trying to do. Your business logic can still be wrong, but you actually know that your coding logic is correct. And very useful for IntelliSense, so speed up development time, cut down on errors. So very nice to have strongly typed language when you're trying to query data, and link to SharePoint and the REST APIs do this for you.